No.
Not going.
As most of you know, or you could figure out, we will not be going to Egypt, Jordan, and Israel in February.
That's good. It's Valentine's Day.
So I've wrestled with this all week. Randall didn't share what the decision was going to be, but I was wrestling in my mind that we're not going to go. We would be less than intelligent to plan to go into that hot spot. So anyway, I have wrestled with this for a lot of different reasons, but we're going to go ahead and proceed with the classes as we'd planned. I think everyone will learn something more about the biblical world, and that'll be good. My topic for tonight was Egypt and Cairo, then and now. And then the more I got to thinking about, Cairo doesn't fit into the Bible. I don't know if you ever thought about that, but it doesn't. Cairo did not really become a city until almost 1000 AD. So it really doesn't fit into biblical history, but Cairo today certainly fits into world history. And let me talk a little bit about Egypt. I got to turn this thing on. As most of you know, it's on the southeastern end of the Mediterranean Sea. In size, it is 3 times the size of New Mexico. It is 50% bigger than the state of Texas. So it's a big piece of land. Now, what's interesting about Egypt is, as you know, the Nile River plays such an important part. I've seen different numbers. 98% of Egypt's population lives in 3% of Egypt's landmass, because it's all next to the Nile. You can't survive for a long time in this big desert. And hopefully, before the end, I'll show you some pictures of a military air base that's just west of Cairo, and it's in the middle of the desert. It's just in the middle of the desert. So hopefully we'll all learn something from this presentation. What do we need to learn? Well, I'm not supposed to talk about the pyramids of Giza. I'm not supposed to talk about the Sphinx. I'm not supposed to talk about the Nile River, but I'm going to tell you, you can't talk about Egypt without talking about some of those things. So I'm going to talk about them or show you pictures of them, but I'm not going to give you a lot of depth to it. I'll let the next presenters talk about those things. Impossible to cover the history of Egypt in this short class. I'm going to give it my best shot to give you what I think is important about it. According to historians, 31 dynasties. Now, when you talk about a dynasty, you're not talking about just one king. We're talking about 31 dynasties, starting in 3100 BC down to 332 BC, ruled over Egypt. And it was called the Old, the Middle, and the New Kingdoms is how they differentiate these. And I know you can't read that, but you can Google it, and you can get a similar presentation that shows the Old Kingdom, and it starts about, this one says 2900, I think, 86. And then you have 3 intermediate periods. Here's the first, second, and third. You have the Old Kingdom, the Middle Kingdom, and the New Kingdom. When we get down here to the New Kingdom, we're talking about the time of the Exodus, whether you're talking about the early Exodus or the late Exodus. So, 31 dynasties. That's a whole bunch of kings. A whole bunch of kings. Now, what we do have are good records that kind of tell us when all of these different kings reigned and things like that. But you should have caught one thing when I said the first dynasty was 3100 BC. According to Bishop Ussher, who put the dates in the Bible and said the world was created in 4004 BC, well, if you follow his logic, the flood had to occur around 2500 BC. How did Egypt start at 3100 BC? What we can't do is exactly mesh the biblical record with the Egyptian record. You just can't do it. We can think what Pharaoh was in charge at the Exodus, but can't prove it. We can reason that it's probably Thutmose the second, but don't know that for sure. And then other people, the people who argue for a late Exodus, saying it was like 1200 and something BC, they say it was Ramses II, because you know they were building the city of Ramses, so they say, oh, it must have been Ramses II, who was the Pharaoh then. I would argue against Ramses II. I think that's too far down in time. I think it was a lot earlier. But anyway, scholars are going to be arguing. You're going to read different things. And I'm just telling you, when you start reading Egyptian history and biblical history, you can't get them to totally agree, if that makes sense. I wish we could, but who was the Pharaoh of the Exodus? Don't know for sure. And I wish we could. I wish we could. It may be so nice if we could, but we just can't do it. It's going to be debated long after we're dead. What do we know for sure? Well, we know that the people of Egypt today began settling after the flood. Does that make sense? World was destroyed during the flood, and so whatever they say about 3100 BC, kind of throw it out the window and know that after the flood, after the Tower of Babel, that the descendants of Ham, Noah's son, settled Egypt. Now, one of Ham's sons from, let me give you what chapter of Genesis. Genesis 10:6. One of Ham's sons was named Mitzrayim. Mitzrayim. Mitzrayim, if you took the Hebrew letters and put them in English, you would come up with Mitzrayim. It's also the word for Egypt. And so we infer from that Ham's son, Mitzrayim, became the forerunners of what we now know as Egypt. But he had some other sons, other descendants, and one of those was Put, Cush, Seba or Sheba, Havilah, Sabta, Dedan. These are all descendants of Ham, and see where they're settled. So Mitzrayim being the son of Ham, that's where Egyptians come from, as a descendant of Noah through Ham. That the other slide, you could go back to it and see where the other sons of Noah, Shem and Japheth, where their descendants, the ones in the rectangle, are descendants of Japheth, and the ones who are descendants of Shem are in this little, what's that, a parallelogram? So anyway, that's one of those things that called the Table of Nations from Genesis 10, I believe it is. But for us, what's important is knowing, well, let me go back here just a minute for this Mitzrayim. I want to tell you one thing that's interesting about Mitzrayim. This word, Hebrew word, appears 681 times in the Old Testament. When I tell you 681 times, I'm going to tell you, any word that appears that many times means it's important. Randall said if it wasn't for the Jews, Egypt would be God's people, for mention. And that's true. Egypt is mentioned so many times. They are critical to the history of God's people. So that's another good reason for looking a little deeper at Egypt. One of the hardest things for me to ever get stuck in my mind, because north's that way, isn't it? South's that way. But Egypt, Lower Egypt is the north, and Upper Egypt is the south. And it's just opposite the way we think. But the reason being is the Nile River flows from the mountains down to the sea. So that helps understand what Upper and Lower Egypt. Why is Upper and Lower Egypt important? Because the pharaohs were the lords of two kingdoms. And the first dynasty, the first king, the first pharaoh was Narma, or Menes, and he united Upper and Lower Egypt and brought them together and made Egypt one kingdom. And so Upper and Lower Egypt becomes important because of being the Lord of two kingdoms. Also, the Pharaoh, let's just talk about what Pharaoh means. That's Pharaoh means, Dr. Cloud used to say the big house. If you look it up in online, it'll say the great house. Pharaoh simply means the great house because that's where the king lived. He lived in the big house, the palace. And so because he lived in the big house, they started calling the king the Pharaoh. And so now we know, we usually call them pharaohs instead of kings. And then we have up here the Delta. And here's the Giza pyramids, which are kind of south and east of Cairo. But here's Memphis. Here's Memphis. Memphis was the capital of Egypt throughout the Old Testament period. And we'll talk about Memphis a little bit. It served as one of the main religious and trading centers beginning with the first dynasty. And throughout history, if we're talking about post-flood, we're talking about whenever the first dynasty really started, Memphis waned at different times depending on the pharaoh. But pretty much it remained the capital of Egypt down through history until the Romans took over. And then it became less and less because the Romans were in charge. And finally, in 395 AD, the Roman emperor by the name of Theodosius I closed and demolished all the temples in Memphis, and that was the end. But notice what date that was, 395 AD. Cairo was not a city then. Cairo, which again is right here, 12 miles north of Memphis, just east of Giza. it got its name from the Arabic word for the planet Mars. And supposedly, the Romans built a fort there in 150 AD, and it just was a settlement. But then in 972 AD, the pharaohs in charge, that dynasty, founded Cairo as a city. So again, almost 1000 AD before Cairo came into play, way past biblical times. So that's how Cairo finally became the capital of Egypt. What else do I want to tell you? Pharaohs were both the heads of state and the religious leaders of Egypt. And years ago, National Geographic put out a volume on, or a magazine dedicated to the pharaohs. I've got it somewhere in my office, but I looked up and found another article about Egypt that National Geographic had done. And I want to read you what it said about the pharaohs. As the religious leader of the Egyptians, the pharaoh was considered the divine intermediary between the gods and Egyptians. He was the priest, if you will. That becomes critical in the Exodus story. That becomes very critical that he had this religious position. Maintaining religious harmony and participating in ceremonies were part of the pharaoh's role as head of the religion. As a statesman, the pharaoh made laws, waged war, collected taxes, and oversaw all the land in Egypt, in parentheses, which was owned by the pharaoh. Well, when did that happen? When Joseph was managing the wheat, was when the pharaoh became owner of all the land in Egypt, if I remember the story from very well, from Genesis. So the pharaoh, when we think of him as a religious leader as well as a political leader, it helps us understand the story of the Exodus and even the plagues. There's a very definite correlation between the gods of Egypt and the plagues that were placed on them. Now, usually that's old King Narma. Whew, I don't know about him, but he's supposedly the first one. But I guess if that was made in 3100 BC, I'd look pretty rough too. But most of the pharaohs were men, but they had a few women who exercised power. This is Thutmose III, the son of maybe the pharaoh of the Exodus. If you can look at the time there, it would probably fit early 15th century, but we don't know. But Thutmose III is known as Thutmose the Great. He's also known as the warrior king because of his military prowess. But he became king at the death of his father. He became pharaoh at age 2. You don't do much when you're a 2-year-old, do you? Well, he had an aunt, Hatshepsut, and she was quite a woman. And for 22 years, she reigned as, they're nice, and they call her the co-regent. She was not the co-regent, she was the ruler. She was the boss for 22 years and ruled Egypt. Finally, when she died, after 22 years, Thutmose III, at age 24, was a well-trained military leader by then, and he became the pharaoh and ruled Egypt. And he's one of the best remembered pharaohs maybe for what he did for Egypt as far as bringing wealth and being military victories. He is well respected in Egyptian history. So that's Thutmose III. I want to switch now to a little bit more biblical things. Memphis, capital of Egypt, mentioned in Hosea. That name, I did not know that. Probably read it, but it never dawned on me that Memphis is actually mentioned. For indeed they are gone because of destruction. Egypt shall gather them up. Memphis shall bury them. Nettle shall possess their valuables of silver. Thorns shall be in their tents. Now, there's another word that basically represents Memphis, a Hebrew word, Noph, and that is Memphis. And it's mentioned several times in the Bible. I put them down at the bottom. I'm not going to read all of those. The princes of Zoan have become fools. The princes of Noph are deceived. They have also deluded Egypt, those who are the mainstay of its tribes. But Noph, or Memphis, is also mentioned in Jeremiah and Ezekiel. So I think that's kind of important that the capital of Egypt is mentioned, although we don't see its name, but it's Noph. And so the capital of Egypt is mentioned in the Bible, up and above those 681 times that Egypt is mentioned. Okay, let's see. Oh, now we got a video we're going to try to show. It's 12 minutes long. It's a Reader's Digest of history of Egypt, and maybe it'll help us understand some of the things I've said. Thank you.
It's brought to you by Captivating History. There is something so uniquely fascinating about the ancient Egyptians that has captivated historians, archaeologists, and the public for the last 200 years. And it's easy to see why. From the strange form of writing called hieroglyphics to the mysterious Sphinx, and from the macabre mummies to the Great Pyramid, ancient Egypt was an enigmatic land that attracted ancient Roman leaders and their militaries to the Egyptian seaports and British Egyptologists to its dusty temples and tombs. Much of our understanding of ancient cultures can be attributed to the ancient Egyptians, who left us many texts and treasures, monuments and myths that offer us tantalizing clues about the exotic and wondrous culture of ancient Egypt. Egypt is a very old land, with civilizations dating to around 5500 BCE. Historians divide ancient Egyptian history into thirds: the Old Kingdom, Middle Kingdom, and New Kingdom. In ancient times, the people of Egypt used the reigns of certain rulers as date markers, making it difficult for today's archaeologists to definitively date structures and monuments. But the Egyptians kept a record of their kings, or pharaohs, that scholars deciphered once they unlocked the key to translating the writing system of the ancient Egyptians. In ancient time and today, life in Egypt depends on the Nile River, the life-sustaining body of water that flows south to north, cutting through the inhospitable desert sands of the Sahara. The Nile is prone to seasonal flooding, which makes the land on either side of its shores rich and fertile, ideal for agriculture. It is a delicate balance, though. If the Nile floods too much, it can destroy farm fields and settlements. If it doesn't flood, the crops could wither and die, causing famine and starvation. The rich land along the Nile first led nomadic people to put down permanent agricultural settlements in ancient Egypt. As these settlements grew, trade and commerce began, class structures arose, and artists and craftsmen flourished. Interaction between the different settlements became more frequent as the people of ancient Egypt moved closer to establishing a unified kingdom. The climate of ancient Egypt was changing. Around 3600, the lands further away from the Nile were becoming drier and hotter, forcing more people to move to the banks of the Nile. The influx of people pushed the limits of the region's food-producing capabilities. As neighboring communities competed for resources, leaders ordered the construction of walls and other defense tactics. 3 main kingdoms formed, and they battled each other for food and trade goods, and for precious stones and gold. After years of competition, one kingdom rose as the most powerful of the 3, and its ruler, King Narmer, put an end to the conflicts and united the 3 kingdoms in 2950, making him the first true ruler of Egypt and the founder of the first nation-state in history. Under King Narmer, Egypt gained its national identity. He established a governmental system, created icons of royalty, such as the crown, and ordered the construction of large and ornate buildings as a show of the importance of the royal family. During King Narmer's reign, or shortly after, a system of writing was developed in ancient Egypt. The written language began as a form of record-keeping for commerce, but quickly developed into a way for royal scribes to keep track of the names and titles of rulers and their lineage and key events. Hieroglyphics allowed them to immortalize their kings in history. Egyptian kings, or pharaohs, were all-powerful in Egyptian society. Pharaohs were viewed as the earthly embodiment of Horus, the link between humans and the gods. Therefore, when a ruler took the throne, he was immediately given divine status. He had a dual role of appeasing the gods and keeping his human subjects safe, productive, and healthy. Times of drought, disease, famine, or war, according to the ancient Egyptians, did not happen by natural means, but because the gods were displeased with the pharaoh and he was being punished. The priests of ancient Egypt were second only to the pharaohs in power. Although they did not have a direct line of communication with the gods like the pharaohs, they were tasked with aiding the pharaoh in keeping the gods happy and the citizens thriving. Priests could become wealthy in ancient Egypt, primarily through the gifts they were given by wealthy people who wanted to put in a good word with both the gods and the pharaoh. A discussion of ancient Egypt could not be complete without addressing 2 of the biggest landmarks in Egypt, the Great Pyramid at Giza and the Sphinx. The Great Pyramid is also called the Pyramid of Khufu, after the 4th dynasty pharaoh who ordered its construction. It is the oldest of the 3 pyramids in the Giza complex and dates to around 2560 BCE. The structure remains a marvel of ancient engineering and construction. Thought to be a tomb, the Great Pyramid was the crowning achievement of Egypt's pyramid builders, who built 80 pyramids in all.
There's one simple hearing hack anyone
more mysterious is the Great Sphinx, also on the Giza Plateau. The enormous statue of the mythical creature who was half human and half lion is often attributed to the pharaoh Khafra, putting its construction at roughly 2494 BC. Some historians and archaeologists, however, theorize that the Sphinx may be much older. We do know that at various points in history, the Great Sphinx was nearly swallowed up by the desert sands. It was buried up to its neck by the shifting sands of the Sahara and had to be dug back out. The enigmatic Sphinx, along with the Great Pyramid of Giza, are symbols of Egypt recognized around the world. The pharaohs that reigned in the New Kingdom between 1570 and 1070 BC wielded more power and command than any rulers who preceded them. These were the rulers who extended Egypt's landholdings, built ambitious temples and monuments, and established foreign diplomacy with surrounding nations. In the 20 years he ruled, Pharaoh Thutmose III built Egypt into a formidable empire through decisive military victories, which are chronicled in Karnak's Hall of Annals. Another of Egypt's New Kingdom pharaohs, Akhenaten, was best remembered for being the ruler who tried to change religious worship in ancient Egypt. Before Akhenaten's reign, Egyptians worshipped a pantheon of deities, in much the same way as the ancient Greeks, Romans, and Norse. Akhenaten, however, forced the citizens into monotheism, with only one supreme god, a sun deity. The people of ancient Egypt naturally balked at this sudden and radical shift in their religious practices, although few spoke out against their pharaoh. After his death, polytheism was restored, statues and monuments of Akhenaten were destroyed or dismantled, and his name was expunged from the record of kings. The beautiful Egyptian queen Nefertiti was married to Akhenaten, but not much else is known about her. Queens only ruled in partnership with their kings. However, historians believe that Nefertiti may have served as the sole ruler of her people after her husband's death, and before the boy pharaoh Tutankhamun began his reign. We may not know much about Nefertiti's background, but we do know what she looked like. A bust of her likeness, believed to have been sculpted in 1345 BC, was unearthed in an artist's work by a German archaeologist in 1912. The bust of Nefertiti, often called the most beautiful woman who ever lived, is on display at a museum in Berlin. Upon the death of Akhenaten, there was no clear heir to assume the throne. The only appropriate person was Tutankhamun, a 7-year-old child. The boy pharaoh, as he later became known, became a household name after his treasure-laden, nearly intact tomb was discovered in the Valley of Kings in 1922 by British archaeologist Howard Carter. Besides the priceless treasures, ornate sarcophagus, and mummified remains of the pharaoh, the tomb held back a curse, if the legends are to be believed, that caused the strange and unexpected deaths of Carter and several members of the archaeological team. The mystery of the curse, along with the trove of valuable artifacts, made a fascinating story, leading to King Tut's immense fame. The discovery of King Tut's tomb and the worldwide attention it garnered put the ancient Egyptians' unique funeral and burial practices in the spotlight. In the mythology and religion of ancient Egypt, the belief in the afterlife was of high importance. Pharaohs and nobles spent their lives preparing for their deaths and tried to ensure that they would enjoy a comfortable afterlife. A key component of this was the preservation of the corpse. The people of ancient Egypt developed effective embalming and mummification techniques, including wrapping the deceased in strips of linen cloth that took advantage of the dry desert climate to keep the body intact. The funeral rites of the ancient Egyptians guaranteed the deceased had a safe journey to the afterworld. Some pharaohs were buried with boats that could transport him to the great beyond. Servants and family members were also buried with the pharaoh so they could serve him in the afterlife. All the worldly objects he may need were also added to the tomb, including items of great value that may have favored the gods. The walls of tombs themselves were lined with prayers and spells meant to protect the dead, and the tombs were hidden and secured so tomb robbers could not find them and steal the precious artifacts inside. Toward the end of the Egyptian Empire, Egypt was an integral part of the political and economic activities of the Mediterranean Sea. Roman and Greek leaders, scholars, and philosophers regularly interacted with Egyptians, which influenced the Egyptian culture. Some of the interactions became personally and politically entangled. Such was the case with Cleopatra, the daughter of Ptolemy XII. A weak and ineffective leader, Ptolemy XII often called on Rome for military and political support. Upon his death, the throne passed to Ptolemy XIII, who was just a child. Therefore, the elder Ptolemy's daughter, Cleopatra, was married to the younger Ptolemy, and she took control of the country in the interim. When he grew older, the two rulers battled each other for control until Julius Caesar and his army arrived in Alexandria to negotiate a truce between them. Struck by her beauty and charm, Caesar and Cleopatra became lovers, and he fathered her child. After Caesar's murder, Cleopatra began a relationship with another prominent Roman, Mark Antony. The couple had 3 children together, but the relationship was torn apart by war. In a true-life Romeo and Juliet scenario, Cleopatra hid in a tomb and sent word to Mark Antony that she was dead. Upon hearing the news, the distraught Mark Antony tried to kill himself. As he lay dying, he was told of the mix-up, that his lover was still alive. He ordered his men to take him to Cleopatra, and he died as she held him in her arms. Devastated by losing her love, Cleopatra allowed an asp to bite her, and she too died. Thanks to stories like that of Mark Antony and Cleopatra, the cursed tomb of King Tut, the mysterious Sphinx, and the cryptic hieroglyphics, the culture of ancient Egypt has inspired wonder and awe. From the desert sands of northern Africa, a complex, mysterious, and fascinating civilization arose that is still the subject of study and research to this day. Unlike any other culture on Earth, the Egyptians accomplished amazing feats of engineering and pioneered the idea of national identity against the backdrop of the enigmatic pyramids. To discover more.
So if you didn't have an opportunity to take the Lord's Supper this morning, it's down the hallway on your left in room 105. I forgot to mention that as we talk about Egypt, the first mention of Egypt is in Genesis 12, when Abram comes to the Promised Land, and there's a famine in the land. He travels on down to Egypt, and we know that sad story of his time in Egypt. Then later, his son Isaac faced a similar famine, and God said, "Don't go to Egypt. Don't go to Egypt." And then Joseph was sold into slavery into Egypt, and Jacob and his whole family ends up in Egypt, then Egyptian bondage, then the Exodus. So many connections with Egypt. Solomon had a connection, just so many. But the one that always gets me is King Josiah. Why that young man decided to do something on his own and gets himself killed by Pharaoh at Megiddo is beyond me. That's always fascinated me, that King Josiah was such a good king, but he went on his own to stop the Egyptians and ended up getting killed in the process. Last week, I talked a little bit about this. When we got word of what Hamas had done, it was within one day, the 50th anniversary of the Yom Kippur War, or the 1973 October War. And I ended up going to Israel with the military and spending the night when Israel was at war with, on all fronts, Golan Heights, Sinai Peninsula. Just like the 67 war, they were surrounded by people who wanted to destroy the nation of Israel. So this whole thing has had a interest to me. And then I was blessed in, I can't remember, 1982, 1983, we were on friendly terms with Egypt. And we started having a series of exercises called Bright Star with Egypt and several other Arab countries. And so for the first time I'd been to Turkey, but I'd never really seen the Arab world. And I'm going to tell you, the first time you go to an Arab world and you hear them start calling for prayer from the minarets, it's kind of spooky. We're not used to that. I hope we never have it in America. I believe in freedom of religion, but when they start building minarets all through Murfreesboro, you're going to understand we're in serious trouble. So anyway, that's a whole different subject. But anyway, the U.S. military funded my trip with some other people. It was supposed to be just a few days. It ended up being 3 weeks, yeah. So anyway, there's the Egyptian air base. It was West Cairo. You can even look it up and find out the history of West Cairo. It was a British air base, I believe, in World War II. But anyway, we went there and met with the powers that be. There's one of the runways. It was kind of like our tar and gravel roads type runway. That's one of their hangars where they would put jets, but I just wanted to show you the sand. We're in the desert, folks, and we're just right outside Cairo, but you're in the desert. And so when we talk about the people living in that narrow path of the Nile, it is that narrow path of the Nile, because you get past it, you're into this kind of sand and desert. There's one of their old Russian airplanes. We had a little guy that went around us. We called him Inspector Clouseau. He was just this little bitty kid, probably 19 years old, in civilian clothes, and he had to go everywhere we went on that base to make sure we didn't take pictures of the Soviet aircraft. Now, I want you to look at this next one. I don't know if you can see, but you can see through the tail. This is a rusted out airframe, and they didn't want us taking pictures of it. And I believe it was because of pride. Anwar Sadat had kicked the Soviet advisors out in 1970, before the 73 war, and now they were inviting the Americans in. We were providing them with aircraft now, and they did not want us to see the remnants of the Soviets. So anyway, I thought I'd throw in a little military. They put us in the Nile Hilton. What a beautiful hotel that was. I shouldn't tell stories about this, but every morning I had them bring breakfast to my room, and I had fresh squeezed orange juice and rolls and coffee, and I was living the high life. I even had a driver. We all had drivers in the car. And so anywhere I wanted to go, this guy would take me. And it was pretty cool. I went up in that tower. It's on the west side of the Nile. I don't know what it was, but it was scary. I would never go up there again in that elevator. I don't know how high it was, probably 30 stories. But that elevator, I wouldn't go up in it again. But I was able to take some good pictures. That's the Nile from my balcony. I was on the side of the hotel so I could look out and see that. But I could also see the Egyptian museum where King Tut's treasures were. So that was pretty cool. That's looking upstream, up the Nile in Cairo. That's one of the street scenes. That looks scary. But my driver lived in an apartment to the left, and we went up to his apartment to have a Coke one afternoon. Beautiful apartment inside, but to get there was kind of scary. I wasn't sure where I was going, if I would come back alive. They were 40 years ago. Technology for construction, they were still doing it the hard way. It was labor intensive. They were still hauling cement up ramps to get to the second story rather than hoisting them up with cranes or something. They were still manually doing a lot of this construction. There was a fresh produce. You just pull your wagon up and the ladies come out and buy their produce. It's just a typical scene, and you see everything. 4 guys having lunch in the shade. I mean, to me, I found the Egyptian people very nice. I found them very, very nice people, as opposed to some other countries I've been into. But I just found them very nice people. If I remember correctly, these guys, that's a Roman aqueduct, if I remember correctly, and they are just refacing it. A mosque. I'd never seen a mosque. This is the City of the Dead. This is a huge cemetery with mausoleums and all this, and people live there. Now, some people live there as just natural. It was part of their work, part of their business, and they live there. But this is probably an alcoholic. He was probably still reeling from the night before when we went through that morning, and he was out waving at us with a cigarette in his hand, waving at us, reeling. But it's an interesting place. You can look it up, the City of the Dead. It's very interesting to read. This was the tomb of the unknown soldier and became Anwar Sadat's tomb after he was assassinated in 1980. I wish I could fix this picture. This is one of my favorite pictures that I ever took. We didn't have cell phones back then, so we had little bitty cameras, you know, Brownie, Instamatics and all. This man was unloading flour, and of course they're dark skinned, and he had a white face. And it was just so cute to see it. I mean, a real life scene like that. Maybe I'll get it blown up someday. That's proof I was there. I know it's hard to see. I tried to lighten it up, but I was there. At the Giza pyramids. And there's other pyramids that never got quite finished. Camel rides. I want to show you one more picture. You never see a picture of the Sphinx from the back. I took it. I don't know why. Cairo then and now. Egypt then and now. Have a good week. Thank you.